Um, Today's daf in the Sechet Menachot, I'm back home for the first time in a while, is 69, Samach Tet. So let me find it. Set the stage. And the discussion we started yesterday, it's a very interesting daf today. I just have to warn you, it's gonna be very strange, many of the sugyot, but I think in a fun way. I told you over some of my family they weren't as enthused as I was, but we'll see. But essentially, some of the issue, and it's a very complicated issue that we're about to get to, which is that the halacha, the basic halacha, is that all the grain that is grown in a year becomes permitted to be eaten, especially in Eretz Yisrael, after you do the Omer on the second day of Pesach. And so that's a fixed date. We said in the Mishnah, what does it mean all the grain? So as long as the grain has taken root before the Omer, then the Omer is matiran, and anything that grows afterwards is permitted. So it's not that the grain has to be present or cut down or even growing in the field. It just has to be rooted in the field. So you have to have planted it, and not just planted it, but taken root before Pesach, which I don't plant much. So maybe that's 10 days. I don't really know, but a certain number of time before Pesach. So that's halacha. Says the Gemara, and we asked the question yesterday about what about grain that you planted between Pesach and Shavuot? So the Shtei Alechem happened, but then the Omer didn't happen. So the next detail on that question, I don't know if you're up to this, Miriam, but we're up to the second line of Samach Tet Amud Aleph.
Oh, wow. Yeah,
Where are you up to? I'm happy to read a little.
uh, I'm like all the way down, like actually 15 lines up. It's okay. I'll catch up afterwards.
Okay, so let me, I'm going to start because it will take us a long time, and maybe at the end if you want. But the second line of Samach Tet Amud Aleph says, Boy Rami Bar Chama, a similar question. So when you get back to the last 15 lines, you'll see that's the question, is what if the grain was planted after Pesach, but before Shavuot? So meaning the Shtei HaLechem, which is usually the Karban on Shavuot that permits the new grain for the Mizbeach, right? If that Karban happened, but the first Karban, which is the Omer, did not happen. Rami Rachama's question now on the second line of Samach Tet Amud Aleph is the following question. Shtei halechem, if you have we think this means grain of the shtei halechem. Hanatza sharia, is it the flowering of the leaves? Not leaves, right? I guess grain doesn't have leaves, but whatever they have, the stalks, right? Is it the sort of hanatza, which is a word, it sounds like budding, right? But does it mean the growth of the stalk that permits it? Meaning, as long as the hanatza has happened before the omer, it's permitted. Oh, chanata sharia, or is it the chanata? Rashi says the chanata is a little bit of a later stage. It's more that the actual seeds are coming out. You can see that. So which one permits it? Says Gemara, what are you talking about? Neither one. My chanatza, my chanata. Why would you referring to whether you see it or whether the stalks are growing, not the stalks, the seed is growing? If you're talking about the flowering in of the actual fruit, meaning, again, this is Rashi's understanding, the grain is the fruit, right? Although we don't think of grain usually as a fruit, but there's a kernel of grain that grows on the stalk of the wheat or the barley. If it has to be when that's coming out, you don't need to wait. You don't need the plant to already be showing signs of grain. Hashta hashrasha sharia, as long as it's mushrash, meaning as long as the roots have taken hold, you don't even need there to be any sign of the grain. You don't need the grain to be showing or the flowering of it to come off. Ella, what we mean must be not the actual flowering or growth of the grain. It means hanatzad da'aleh, v'chanata da'aleh. It means the growing of the leaf, right? So the question is, does the leaf itself have to be coming out, which would be a symbol to you? This is again one way to read it, Rashi's way, that it's being mushrash, right? Meaning it's hard to know when a plant is taking root in the ground because we can't see underground. So maybe you have to get the first shoots of the leaves, not the leaves, but like the stalk coming up, and the chanata, meaning a little bit of a later procedure. Is that considered to be mihavi ki hashrasha? Is that proof, or is that equivalent to it rooting in the ground, and therefore the Omer permits it? Olo, or is that not enough of a sign? Tekum, we didn't resolve that question. So that is unresolved in terms of when is the exact time that it becomes mutar if the plant is still growing. So that is the next question of Rami Bar Chama. The third question, which is not Rami Bar Chama, but says the Gemara now 8 lines from the top, another very, very interesting question. Says Boy Rava Bar Rav Chanan, Chitin Shezaran Bekarka. Now we're going to start off very simple, and stop me if I miss this. It's very confusing. But you have grain that is planted in the ground, right? Oh, Nava's joining. Okay. Hello, Nava. We are on Daf Samach Ted Amud Aleph, around 8 lines in the top, just in the beginning of a new question. Boy Rava Bar Rav Chanan. So Rava Bar Rav Chanan asked the following question. Let's say you take grain, chitin, shezaran bekarka, and you put it in the ground, and you sow it, right? It's zareh. So Omer Matiran or Ein Omer Matiran. And then Pesach happens and you bring the carbon Omer. Does the Omer permit the grain or not permit the grain? This is where, what's the question? Hechidami. What's your question? Ida Ashrish, if the grain took root in the ground, Tanina, we learned in the Mishnah that the Omer is matir. So if you plant seeds, let's say 20 days before Pesach, and by the time Pesach comes, they're already rooted in the ground, and then over the next month, they grow up to be a big, beautiful grain stalk, then they're mutter. The Ida lo ashrish, and if they didn't take root before Pesach, before the Omer, Tanina, we learned in the Mishnah that the Omer is not matir. It's not, as we had in the Mishnah, we're going to have this tomorrow, Im hishrishu kodem la Omer matiran. If the seeds of the grain are mushrash, they get roots before the time of the Omer permits them. Im lav asurin yavo Omer haba. If not, they're asur until next year. So what's your question? If you put seeds in the ground, it depends. If they have roots, then the Omer is matir. If they don't, it's not matir. It says, well, no. Lo tzricha, the question here is, the chatzdinu v'zarinu kodem la'omer. You took your seeds and you planted them before Pesach, okay, before the Omer. Chatzdinu literally means you basically you cut down earlier grain, right? So you have grain from last year. You cut it down. When you cut down grain, you can grind up the grain and eat it, but you also can do what's really important is you can take the grain and replant it, right? So, which is the only way you get new grain, right? So you took some of the grain, instead of eating it, you zarinu kodem omer, you planted it before the Omer. V'ata omer v'chalafalau, and then the Omer happened, and it's in the ground, and it's presumably not mushrash, let's just say, okay? And the question now is, the day after Pesach, you decide we're running out of food. We took all our food and put it in the ground. Let's dig it up and eat it, right? So presumably, again, this is not something we would think of because we're very rich, and I guess they didn't do a lot either. But in theory, you put seeds in the ground. 5 days later, you can dig them up and eat them, right? Now, again, I don't think anyone did this on purpose, but let's say you put them in the ground before Pesach. The Omer happened, they're in the ground, and then you decide 5 days later you want to dig them up and eat them. Now, presumably they should be mutar because this is grain from last year, right? And the Omer permitted them already. The question is that it was in the ground when when the Omer happened, and one of the things you might think is that you basically had planted it, so it's batel to the ground, right? So that's one of our questions. The question is, Mao linkuti umechol minayo. What can you reap? It's not like really harvesting it, right? You're digging it up and taking out these seeds. Can you eat them? Can you take them from the ground and eat them? Do you say, look, the fact that it was in the ground when you did the Omer, it's like you put it in a pitcher, meaning it's like it's in a container in your shelf, right? Where if you put your flour in the container on the shelf and the Omer happened, it would be mutar. These happen to be in the ground, but they were distinct kernels of grain. Visharinu Omer, and therefore the Omer should permit them. O Dilmar, do you say, look, once you plant them, batalu lagabe ara, they become nothing compared to the ground, meaning they're planted. They're not free things. They're part of the ground, in which case the Omer is not matir. And now that and they weren't mushrash, they didn't seed, right? They didn't get roots. So now if you dig them up, they're not mutar because the Omer didn't work. So that's the first question. We don't have an answer. But we ask a very similar second question, which is, Yesh lahem ona or ein lahem ona. Now, if you recall in Bava Metzia, yeah, we learned a lot about the halachot of ona'ah. I don't know how we translate ona'ah. It literally means like cheating someone, right? So the halachot of ona'ah are that if you sell someone something and you misrepresent it by a small percentage, then usually halacha is that people forgive it. They're like, that's not a big deal. If it's a decent percentage, which the Gemara in Bava Metzia said was a fifth or a sixth, depending, different opinions, Then people are makbid. The sale is in fact, but you have to pay back the amount that you cheated them by. And if it's above a certain percent, then the whole thing is canceled. Now, one of the halachot we learned above in Mitzvah is that ein ona'ah b'karkaot. There's no ona'ah when it comes to karka. So that if you sell karka and you misrepresent it and you give the wrong price and the person buys it, there's no halacha of ona'ah and that sale doesn't go back, right? So now the question is, you took this grain, you took kernels of grain. Again, this is why it's complicated because I'm going to say it all wrong. But you took kernels of grain from last year, right? And you could grind these up and make them into flour and eat them. But instead of grinding them up, you replanted them with the seeds and they're in the ground. And then you go to someone and say, I will sell you my field, right? This field, which I've planted with 100 seeds. And the guy says, okay, I'll pay you $1,000, whatever it is. And then it turns out that you only planted 80 seeds, right? You cheated them, basically. So the question is that cheating them in the seeds, which would be a metaltalin and there'd be ona'ah, or is it cheating them in the karka, in the land, because the seeds are in the land, right? And the same question we had about the omer, we have about the halacha of ona'ah. So let me read that inside. So the second question, where it's hard to give the place, but around 15 lines on the bottom, if you look at Tosfot where he says peel, where he says elephant, it's immediately to the right of that. And that's just a preview. We're going to get to elephants in a little bit. So just to the right of where Tosfot says peel, the question is, yesh lahem ona'ah, o ein lahem ona'ah. Seeds that were put into the ground and then sold, is there ona'ah, cheating, halachot of cheating, which would apply to metaltalin, to seeds, but would not apply to land? So it says, one second, what's the case? Hechidami. I mean, I just gave you a case. But what is the case where you cheated the person? I mean, if let's say you go to someone and say, look, I'll sell you this land with the seeds in it. I planted 6 seeds, right? Or 60,000. It doesn't, Rashi says 6 core, but whatever, 6 of a big number, right? And it turns out, and witnesses come and say, he's lying to you. He only planted 5 core of seed in this ground. So there, the question might be, well, remember, that's 1/6, that's ona'ah, 5 to 6. So is that ona'ah because it's karka, not ona'ah because it's karka, or ona'ah because it's metaltalin? But says the Gemara, it shouldn't matter there. Amar Rava, because Rava said in Bava Kama, in Bava Metzia, I mean, kol davar shebemidah v'shebemishkal shebeminyan, anything that is a distinct unit, where you sell it by 1 pound, or 1 unit, or 12 donuts or something, afilo pachot michdei ona'ah choser. Then if even less than the amount of ona'ah is choser, meaning if I go to the store and say I want 10 tomatoes and they give me 9, that's not ona'ah, that's not giving me what I asked for. The whole concept of ona'ah is when there's things that are in general, right, where you give a general statement and they're a little bit off, is a person forgive that. But if you said I want 6, or you said I'm selling you 6 core of seed, and it's 5 core, it doesn't matter whether it's karka or metaltalin. It's not ona'ah, it's lying, and it's mekach ta'ot, and it goes back, right? Ella, the case must be the Amar Le, where the person, where say Reuven came to Shimon and said, look, I want to sell you this field. I planted grain in the field. And Shimon says, how much grain? And he says, I planted the normal amount, right? Without saying a number. Shadaiba kidiboila. I planted the right amount for this field. I calculated, I'm a farmer. I know how much seed is appropriate for a field. I properly planted this field. And then Atu Sadi v'Amri delo shadaba kidibayla. And their witnesses then come and say, no, he underplanted. So there, it's not a question of number. It's a question of general feeling, right? Meaning not feeling, but general estimation. And that's where ona'ah comes in place. So if it was karka, there's no ona'ah. If it was seeds, there's ona'ah. So that's the question. Yesh lahem ona'ah. Do you say there is ona'ah because dikiman deshadya bekadya dami, that the seeds that are in the ground are equivalent to seeds that are in a pitcher in your closet, and so just the ground is the holder, that the seeds are the entity, and therefore there is ona'ah. V'yesh lahem ona'ah. Odilma batalun legabi ara. Or do you say because they're planted and they were planted with the intention of growing, that it's actually part of the land now? And so, although I'm not buying the land from you, I don't really care about your land. I only care about the plants that are going to grow there. The fact that it's in the ground makes it karka, and therefore there's no ona'ah. So we don't answer this question either. It's the second open question. The third question, which is the same question and related, is there's a halacha in Bava Metzia as well that you don't swear. Remember, usually if you have a claim against a person and it's a modeh b'miktzat hata'ana, right, where I say to someone, you owe me $1,000, and they say I only owe you 500, they have to swear about the other 500, right? So you have to make a shvuah. The halacha is that you don't make a shvuah about karka, about land. So if I say to someone, you sold me, you owe me 2 acres of land, and he says, I only owe you 1 acre, he doesn't have to swear about the other acre. So the same question about the seeds, right? Nishba'in alehem, do you swear about the seeds? Or nishba'in alehem, or do you not swear about the seeds? In this case, it's straightforward, right? The one I just said. Kiddishad, do you say kiddishad yevekadadamye, that the seeds are, again, in the ground? It's the equivalent to putting them in a pitcher, in a a cod, a pitcher, right? Cod katan, got the song, right? So is it like putting it in a pitcher? Okimetaltali dami, and it's like their seeds are basically sitting in the jar. Oh, v'neshba'in alehem, and then you'd have to swear if you were modeh b'miktzat about them. Oh, dilma batulo gabe ara, or do you say that they are canceled in relation to the earth because you planted them? Ukimekarka aidami, ve'in neshba'in alehem, and the answer finally of all three questions is teiko. We don't know the answer, so we leave it open. And it's a relevant question for the Omer, right? Which is where we started, because if you plant things in the ground and then then you bring the carbon Omer, and then you want to dig them up from the ground and eat them, we don't know if the Omer was matir them like other food in the store, or whether the Omer is not matir them because they're underground. So that is an open question. Now, the next level of this question, which is where it starts getting a little bit more fantastical and less regular, is there are other ways you can get seeds. And the example the Gemara is about to give is that, and again, the Gemara often talks about this because it was, I think, the Megillat Eicha talks in the Medrash Eicha at least, that, in times of tremendous famine, there was a phenomena where you would have an animal that would eat a bunch of seeds and then excrete those seeds in their dung, right, unchanged. And there's something about coffee. People drink coffee this way. I don't know if people know that they're coffee seeds that come out in the dung of animals, and then you grind them, and there's like some famous coffee, I think. I've heard that. Hopefully not Starbucks. Anyways, so let's say an animal eats grain, right? And then you go through, or someone goes through the stool of that animal and identifies seeds in that stool that they could then wash off, hopefully, and grind up and make into flour. So the question, of course, is that really flour? Or do you say because it's passed through the digestive system of an animal, it's become stool, basically, right? And it's not halacha flour. So let's read that question inside. That's Rami Barchama's question, with the first word of a line around 20 lines from the bottom. Boy Rami Barchama. Rami Barchama asked the following question. Chitin shebiglalei bakar. If you find grain, chitin is wheat, right, in the stool of a cow, or se'orin shebiglalei behima, or you find barley in the stool of other animals, mahu. What is the status of that grain and any flour and wheat that comes, not wheat, flour and bread that comes from that grain? So it says, well, mahu for what? What's your question? Lamai. What detail are you asking me about? Maybe your first question is it a food, right? So remember, there's special halachot of tumat ochlim, of tuma of food stuff. Is this considered to be a food, or do you say this is disgusting? This is stool. No one's going to eat this, right? So let's say it becomes tameh. Is that tuma of dirt, which is not tameh? Remember, dirt does not become tameh because, right, it's pshutei, whatever. It's not functional. Or do you view it as food? It's like, well, that's a really good question. But the Tosefta already asked that question. Tanina, we have a Beferish of Brighton. You know the Tosefta didn't forget about this one, right? The Tosefta says the following, very straightforward. Bakar, if you have wheat that came out of the stool, the feces of cattle, or Sorin Shibiglalei Behima, then it depends. Chishav Alehem La'achila. If you say, I'm going to gather together those seeds and I'm going to grind them up and eat them, the machshava ein mitama tumat ochlin. Just thinking about it is not enough to make them tameh. So, meaning not make them tameh. Even if they then touch something tameh, they're not food. They're stool, right? But, however, says the Braita, this is Tosefta, liktan la'achila, if you actually pick them up and you do an act in order to gather them together, in order to eat them, then mitameh tumat ochlin. So the Braita gives a very clear answer, which if a thought's not enough, an action is enough. But there's no question. You could debate whether you agree with this or not all day long, but that's the answer about Tuma. So what's your question, Rami Bar Chama? Ella, the question for Rami Bar Chama, it must be liminachot. Can you gather together these seeds, grind them up to flour, and bring a carbon mincha from these things? So Nava's shaking her head. Right? Rami Bar Chama asked a question, and Nava thinks it's a bad idea. Says Gemara, obviously Nava's right. Pshita delo. Of course you can't take this and bring it as a carbon mincha in front of Hashem. Because as Malachi says, and we read the Haftorah, Hakriveuna lepechatecha. And Malachi gives them the whole speech. How could you bring these lame animals, the Iver, Piseach, right, the blind, the lame animals, to Hashem? Would you bring such a thing to your pechatecha, your governor, right? Your leader? Hayirtzecha yisapanecha. Would that person like it? Would they be nice to you for that? Meaning it's clearly disgusting. Of course you can't bring this to Hashem, whether it's food or not food. Says the Gemara, you're right. The question that Rami Bar Chama had is, of course you can't gather these seeds together, these grain together, grind it up and make it into a carbon mincha. But can you launder it as it might be? Meaning, can you take the seeds and replant them and then grow grain? What about the grain that comes from these seeds, right? What about the next generation? So at Lotzricha Dinaktinu, you gather together the seeds, the grain from the stool of the animal, Vizarinu, and you plant it, and then it grows into new grain. The kaboi la'atuyi menachot minau, you want to bring a mincha from the grain that grew from these seeds that you salvaged from the dung of the animal. My. So what do you say then? Do you say that the reason you can't use it from the animals mishum dimi astinu, because it's disgusting, and therefore kivan dizarinu azlam yisutaru. By planting them, you laundered them basically. You cleaned them up, right? You made it to the next generation, and so therefore these are no longer a grain that came from the dung of an animal. This is a new plant. So maybe that's okay. Odilma, or perhaps, one of the reasons why you couldn't bring this to Hashem is because obviously, if this seed passed through the digestive tract of an animal, something about it was changed. There are enzymes in the animal. There's things in there that take something away from it. And therefore, mishum kichishutahu, it's because it's weaker, meaning it's not, although it looks like grain and it might even, be flour, it's weaker than real regular born grain. And therefore, and so too the product of the seed that's planted is not going to be as good as regular grain. And therefore, forever, once a seed or once a piece of grain has passed through the digestive tract of a cow, it's no longer called grain. And obviously it is, you can still plant it maybe and grow, but it's not going to be as good as regular grain, and therefore it can never be brought for a carbon, teko, and unfortunately we don't have an answer to that. So you have to avoid doing this in real life. So,
well, it's kind of interesting because last week the rabbi of the Riverdale Jewish Center brought something similar to this, not exactly, and he gave a Pesach halacha. And his example was, suppose the one wants to take seeds from a tomato that is placed on a McDonald's hamburger. And there are different shilohs, whether that they take the tomato and they separate the seeds. So the tomato, was it hot enough? Did it was it basar v'chalav or not? But ultimately, you take the seeds out. Can you take the seeds out and then plant them and grow the seeds, and you're growing, and it's essentially another plant, another tomato. And the halacha is basically, it went through a whole discussion. It would be permitted. It would not be considered treif. It would be kasher, because the seeds are now become a new entity, and it's not the same seeds. Even if you would presume that the seeds might have touched the meat, it would have been hot. But once you've taken extracted seeds and replanted them, it would be kasher, and you could eat that new tomato.
So that's very interesting halacha. I'm not familiar with it. Thanks for sharing. But I think it's very consistent with the Gemara. So again, what the Gemara is saying is that the seeds are disgusting. But if you plant them and you grow new grain, that new grain would be permitted, because just like you said, you basically have taken away that first status from it, and it's no longer considered ma'us, no longer considered disgusting. In your case, you're saying it's no longer considered basar b'chalav or whatever treifa, right? I think the question of our Gemara, though, is maybe that's not enough for a karba. Because even though it's true that it's been cleaned by replanting it, it's still not considered to be a good piece of grain because it passed through an animal, and therefore it's not good enough for a mincha. But I think for your point, it's very interesting, and I think very consistent with the Gemara. Again, I was not familiar with that, so I can't say more. Okay, thanks for sharing. The next case, 7 lines from the bottom, we finally get to the elephant that we've been all waiting for today. So the next question of Bai Rami Bar Chama, remember Chama always has the best questions, by the way. Bai Rami Bar Chama, what if you have a peel? You have a big elephant. Now, elephant's important here because it has to be a large animal. Shebalak fifa mitzrit. The elephant swallowed a Egyptian basket, is how we usually translate it, right? Meaning he swallowed, I guess, something that's a little flexible, right? Not a stone basket, a wicker basket is how mine translates it. So basically swallowed a
Palm
basket.
fiber.
What'd you say?
Palm fiber.
Palm fiber. Okay, I'll take that. Either way, you made a basket out of organic material. It's bendable. Maybe there were delicious fruits inside of it. The elephant swallowed the whole thing, and the thing went intact through its digestive tract and came out the other end. So you've got a basket coming out of the elephant. So it says that Rami Bar Chama, Pil shabalak fifa mitzrit, v'hikiya, and he passed it as stool, derech beit harei, through its behind, mahu. What's the status of that basket? Well, you can see it in the store. Special basket that passed through an elephant. It says, well, what's your question again? What do you mean, what's the halacha? It's a basket. What do you mean? Lamai, what's your question? Well, maybe you can cancel its tumah. Let's say the basket was tameh, right? And now the basket went through the elephant. It comes out the other end. Maybe it's clean because it's no longer a basket. Now it's considered basically stool of an elephant. And so maybe that was enough to take off the tumah of the basket. Says Gemara maybe, but there's a Mishnah, or a Braita at least, I guess a Mishnah, that says that it doesn't. Tanina, we learned in a Mishnah the following. Kol kelim, any object that you have, meaning if you make something and it's not quite clear yet if it's ready to be used, right? So it's something that could be finished further. It's your din lidei tumatam b'machshava. If you have intention, I'm going to use it for a final product, then it's mekabel tuma. It's ra'ui lekabel tuma, right? Because again, only things that are mekabel tuma are things that are ready to be used. But let's say you have an object, a table, which in theory you could keep working on it, or you can say this is done. So if you have a machshava, this is done, then it's ra'oi lekabel tuma. But ein olin mitumatan ela b'shinui ma'aseh. Things only lose their status of tuma if they physically change. For example, you have a pot and you break it and then you put it back together, it's no longer tameh because you broke the pot, right? But with this wicker basket, or whatever Miriam called it, this basket, something, right? It didn't change, this palm basket. It came intact through the elephant. So the tumah wouldn't go away because you didn't change anything about it. So that's not a question. So lo tzricha, you know what the question is? The question is a little more subtle. The elephant did not actually swallow the basket. So sorry, that case we're going to go back from. What the elephant swallowed were the actual leaves of the palm tree, right? The pieces, like when we make our lulav with. The bala hutzin, right? The elephant ate a whole bunch of palms and they all came out in its dung, intact. And you gathered them together, hopefully washed them off as well. And then you knitted them into a basket. You took those pieces, vavdinu kfifa mitzrit, and you made the pieces into a basket. And the question now becomes, is this considered to be a wicker basket, or is this considered to be a dung basket, right? Meaning, mi havi ikul, do you say that basically the animal digested the palm branches, right? And they are now not palm branches. They are stool of an animal. And therefore, havile, turn the page, kiklei glalim. It's like an object you can make glalim. You could take stool, dung from an animal, and turn it into a pan, right? And fire it up in the oven and make it hard. Or clay adama, you could do that with earth vessels. I mean, this is again where you don't glaze it or make it with anything professional. Those things are ein mekablim tuma. Those things are not mekabel tuma. To Amar Mars, we learned clay avanim, clay lim that are made out of natural stones, right? And clay glalim, kalim that are made out of stool. And clay adama, that are made out of earth, ein mekablim tuma. Those things are not mekabel tuma. Lo midivrei Torah, sofrim. So maybe the branches of this palm tree, not branches, but this palm, I don't know what you call them, the pieces of this palm tree, that came through these palm branches, we'll call them, right? Palm leaves that came through the animal are considered dung of the animal. And therefore, if you sew them together and make a wicker basket, it's not a wicker basket, it's a stool basket. Odilma lo have equal. Or do you say that no, no, look, they came out whole. So they're obviously not ruined. They are still branches of a palm tree. So that was the question of Rami Bar Chama. Very interesting question. I'm sure we all wondered the same thing. Says Gemara, well, I have an answer for you. Because if you look now, we're up to the fifth line of Daf Samach Tet Amud Bet. Well, why don't you tifshot lay? You can prove this question. You could resolve this question. From the very famous story, everyone knows this is one of our favorite stories, of Ula in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yod Sadak. This is where Little Red Riding Hood comes from. There was Maaseh, there was a story, Ubalu Ze'evim Shnei Tinokot Mevar Yarden. Right? The very famous story where the big bad wolf swallowed two children, killed two children, Be'ever HaYarden, and then, of course, parts of those kids came out of the wolf as stool. So you can identify in this wolf, I don't know what kind of wolf it was, that there were still like little arms or legs or pieces of these children that were coming out. And the question, of course, that the rabbis wondered, Snav is wondering, is this considered to be a piece of a human, which would, of course, be mitamei tumat mate, or is it considered to be stool of an animal, right? So what's the halakha? It seems like a very similar question. And that happened, the story happened, Uba ma'aseh lefnei chachamim, and they came in front of the rabbis and said, what's the status of this? You know, we see this wolf left behind these droppings, and there's clearly identifiable pieces of this child in it. Is that tuma of a human, or is it not? And the chachamim said, tiaru et basar, that the meat or the little skin and flesh that you see is not tamei. It's tahar because it's not considered to be human remains anymore. It's considered animal processed stuff. So you see clearly that by going through an animal, even if it looks like it's still identifiable, it changes its status. It's now considered to be animal dung, not what it was when it went in. So you can prove it from that case. Well, says well, that's not really a good proof because shani basar dirachich, flesh of a human is very soft, so it gets digested and gets changed. But when you have a branch, that's a harder thing. Think about the next part because you didn't read the end of the story. Livshot miseifa. The rabbi said in the second part is that the basar is tahar, but timuat atzamot. But if little tiny bones come out of this animal, those are tamei, because the bones are not considered to be digested by the animal. So why don't you prove from the bones that if the bones are considered not digested, the leaves of the palm branch are considered non-digested? Well, bones are a lot harder than the palms. Shani atzamot akushitve. The bones are very hard. So that story actually illustrates the exact question of Rami Bar Chama. The bones are considered to be non-digested, and therefore they're human remains. The skin and the flesh is considered to be digested, so it's a non-human remain. But what about the fibers, basically, of this branch that went through the elephant or any animal, right? Is that considered to be a branch, in which case, if you sew it together as a basket, it becomes tamei? Or is it considered to be remains of an animal, in which case it won't become tamei? So that was another question of Rami Bar Chama. Okay, it's going to get better and better. Don't worry. So the next question is Reb Zera's question. I guess the Gemara, when it gets into a mood, it gets really going. So says Reb Zera the following question. We have a halacha. Let me read the Gemara first, then I'll explain it. By Reb Zera, we're around 10 lines from the top. Remember that in order to bring grain for the shtei alechem, you have to. The pasuk says it has to be mimoshvotechem, right? It has to come from your dwelling places, which means not outside of Eretz Yisrael. So asked Rabbi Zera, what if it comes from the heavens? What about chitin sheyardu be'avim? If you have grain that comes down from the clouds, mahu. What's the halacha of that? Right? Now Rashi explains that what is grain coming? How do you have grain coming down from the clouds? It usually rains water, not grain. So Rashi says it means there was like a tornado, right? Like Dorothy. And there was a ship in Haifa, and the tornado came and lifted up the grain from the ship and dropped it down on your neighborhood in Kfar Saba. I don't know, right? So that grain was coming down from the skies instead of coming up from the ground. So is that okay? This is where okay for what? Lamai. Menachot, if you're asking, can you use that grain for a carbon mincha? Milo, why wouldn't you be allowed to use it? Just because it came from the sky, it's still grain. Ela l'shtei halechem. A specific question of Rabbi Zera was for the carbon of the shtei halechem, where it says mimoshvo techem amarachmana. The grain has to come from in your dwelling places, which we interpret to mean in Eretz Yisrael, right? La'afuke dechutz la'aretz delo. So maybe that excludes, it can't come from Saudi Arabia, right? Or Italy. But the avim shaper dami. But the clouds, the sky, is not a problem. All the pasuk is excluding from Moshvo Techem is things that grow outside of Eretz Yisrael. Odomar, would you say, Ni Moshvo Techem dafka? That Moshvo Techem means it has to grow in Eretz Yisrael. And if it comes from the sky, it didn't grow in Eretz Yisrael. Now, I feel the avim nami lo, right? And the clouds would not be included, right? Says the Gemara, I don't understand. This sounds like a very funny case, but really, does grain come down from the sky? Umika ki hai gavna? Does it ever really, ever get wheat falling down from the sky? Says Marian, of course, everyone knows the story of, what's the story now? Cloudy the chance of meatballs, right? Everyone knows. Kida adi taya, like adi, the taya means like Arab or nomad. Nachita le rum kizba chiti v'tlata parsi. He told the story that it rained down, it came down on them. A kizba of Hiti, right? That was tlata parsi. It was the height of a Rashi says it was the height of a tefach and a little bit more over 3 whole parsa. I mean, there was this huge thing of grain that came down from the sky one time. So such a thing can happen, and therefore you have to wonder what the halacha is. Now, Tosfot is very bothered by the pshat I just gave, which is Rashi's pshat. And the reason Tosfot is bothered is Tosfot says, I don't really understand. If you're talking about a case where you had a tornado at sea, then why does it matter that you had a tornado? Where did the grain come from, right? If the grain came from Italy and it went up in the sky and dropped in Eretz Yisrael, it's from Italy. If the grain came from Eretz Yisrael and it went up in the sky and dropped down, it's from Eretz Yisrael. Right? Why would it matter that it went up, through a tornado? Would it change the status of the grain? So Tosfot says, I have a much better explanation. We're talking about magic grain that falls from the sky. So that's really made me think of giants living in the sky dropping down grain. So Tosfot says it's something else. It came al yedei nes near Juba Avim. It was a miraculous falling of grain. So basically the question of the Gemara then, I'm not sure that's an easier explanation, but the question of the Gemara is that, when the Torah says it should come from your dwelling places, does that include miracles or not include miracles? So that's the question of Rebbe Zera. Okay, now back to more practical questions. Now that we have the more magical ones. Ask Rebbe Shimon Bar Pazi. We are a little more than halfway down. I'd say around 12 lines from the bottom, maybe. Ask Rebbe Shimon Bar Pazi again, these are very technical and very interesting theoretical questions. So said Rebbe Shimon Bar Pazi, let's say you have a shibolet. You have a stalk of grain. Shehivia shlish kodem la'omer. Okay, it grew more than a third, right, before the Omer. So you planted this, let's say Purim time, your grain starts growing, and it's grown not completely, but it's more than a shlish, which we consider to be a decent amount, a full, not mature, but growing plant. And so before the Omer, and it's in the ground, right, when the Omer happens, right? And remember, we said earlier, of course, that anything in the ground when the Omer, even if it's less than a third, would be mutar by the Omer, okay? So sorry, I got the case wrong. Let me slowly. Your Shimon Bazi said you had a shibolet shivia shlosh kodem la'omer. It was not in the ground, so va'akra, and then you uprooted it from the ground before Pesach, right? So 2 days before Pesach, you decide, I don't want this thing in the ground anymore. I don't know why. Maybe you needed to clear your space so people could get into your door before Pesach, and you uprooted your grain plants, but you didn't cut them, right? You just took them out by the roots, and your intention was maybe I'll replant them, right? But during the Omer, the day of the Omer, they were sitting in your backyard, on the not in the ground. They were sitting on the shelf. And then shatla la'acher Omer, and then you replant them after the Omer. Okay, now to be clear, because this was grain and had been a third, and the Omer happened, that grain is permitted to eat, right? So you're fine to use these shibolot, these stalks, right? The problem is that you then replanted them and the hosifa, and they kept growing, right? So let's just say, again, there's a lot of debate in the Gemara about whether new things grew or the ones that you had got bigger. But let's pick the second one. It's a little bit easier. They got a little bit bigger, right? So basically, you took your stalks, you took them out of the ground before Pesach, the Omer happened, but then you put them back in the ground after the Omer, and they grew some more. So how do you view the growth of those plants? Mao, what do you do? Do you say, Batar Ikar Azlina? Let's go after the main part of the plant, which was planted and rooted and harvested before the Omer, Visharya HaOmer, and the Omer permitted it. And now when I replant it, everything that grows from it remains permitted, right? And just to remind you, the same thing would have been true if you never uprooted it, right? Let's say your plant is in the ground when the Omer happens, and the seeds are a third grown, right? And then they grow to full size. Everything that grows after the Omer is permitted, right? Because remember, the Omer is matir, anything that was mushrash, anything that rooted by the time of the Omer. So do you treat it that way? Or do you say, look, the fact is you took this out of the ground before the Omer and you put it back in the ground, and therefore batar tosefet azlinan, you have to look at the extra part as being a new planting. Excuse me, it was planted after the Omer, and therefore Achiyav Omer Abba. It doesn't become permitted until a year from now when you bring the next Omer. So how do you view this plant that was basically replanted after the Omer? So that was the question. The Gemara says, well, this is a good question, but we've already discussed this actually, because Tifshal Mehad Amar Rabbi Avo Amar Rabbi Yochanan. There's a complicated and beautiful case of Rabbi Avo in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. And this case has to do not with the Omer, but with the mitzvah of Arla, right? Remember that a plant, like at least the Shiva Minam, that you plant, that in the first 3 years after you plant something, you're not allowed to eat any of the fruit that grows from that plant because it's called Arla, right? So let's say you plant a vine, and pick an example of a grapevine, and it's young, Yalda. It's a 2nd-year-old, right? It's within, it's or 2-year or 3rd-year-old. It's within the time of Arla. So everything that grows on that plant is usr, right? But then you were sivka bizkena. You grafted it with an older plant, right? Uba perot. And there were fruits on the first plant, meaning there were arla fruits, right? So you had little tiny grapes on the first plant. And then you added the second plant and it grew much bigger, right? Because the second plant was more mature and had more resources. Says Rabbi Avo named Rabbi Yochanan, Afilo hosif b'matayim. Even if the new growth from the new plant, which is the old plant, right? Meaning the elderly plant, the plant that's 5 years old or 10 years old, even if that after you combine them, the grapes grew 200 times, right? Now remember, 200 is a very important number because Arla is usually batel in 200. Meaning if you take one grape of Arla and you mix it with 200 grapes that are not Arla, it's batel. Right? Rashi quotes the source of that, but that's halacha. Says Rabbi Yochanan, even in this case where it grew 200 times after you added the new plant, it would be asur. Why do you see that? Now, what do you prove from here? You prove from here that since the first growth that started was a growth from an Arla plant, no matter how much it grows after that, even 200 times remains an Arla plant, right? And we're going to try to prove from here that the same is true by the Omer. That because the first plant of the grain was permitted because it was picked and grown before the Omer, if you put it back in the ground and it grows some more, it'll still be permitted. So that's how we're going to try to prove it. But before we try to prove it, we have another proof from Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, Rabbi Yonatan, sorry. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, in the name of Yonatan, said something very similar about something else called kilayim, right? So let's say you have a case of a batzal, you've got an onion, sheshatlo bekerem. You take your onion and you plant it in a vineyard. Now that's totally prohibited because that's klei hakerem, right? It's onions and grapes. You're not allowed to mix those, and the onions become prohibited. But let's say after you do that, ne'ekar hakerem, you uproot all of the grapes in the vineyard. So there's no more vineyard here. There's just an onion sitting in the middle of a field. And then the onion keeps growing and growing and growing. Afilo hosif b'matayim. Even if it adds 200 times, right? The growth of that happened while it was with the kerem. The fact is, it started off as kilayim and asur. it remains prohibited. So you see from both examples of Rabbi Yonatan from Shon Bar Nachmani and the case of Rabbi Avomer Rabbi Yochanan, that if it starts off prohibited, even if you grow a tremendous amount more, it remains prohibited. So why don't you say the same thing by the Omer? That since the Omer permitted this plant, then you put it back in the ground, the fact that it grew remains mutar. It says the Gemara, there's a big difference because in the Omer, you want to say it's mutar. You're going to continue eating it. In the other two cases, it was asur. So that itself is the question. He gufa kami boile. This, in fact, was the question that we were asking. Is it clear, mifship shitale the Rabbanan, de batar ikar azlinan? Is it obvious to the Rabbanan that you always go after the first growth? And so if the first growth is kilayim, it's prohibited. If the first growth is arla, it's prohibited. And if the first growth is permitted from the Omer, it's permitted. Loshna lekula, loshna lechumra. Doesn't matter whether it's to allow it or to prohibit it. Odilma, or you can't prove that. Svuki misafkale. Maybe they weren't sure. The rabbi said, we don't know if you go after the majority or if you go after the first growth. And therefore, lechumra amrina. If the first growth is usr, you have to lechumra assume everything is usr. But lekula lo amrina. We don't know if you say the same thing, lekula. And the answer is teku. We don't have a resolution. So this is another question that we don't resolve, which is whether or not you view the extra growth as being something that would permit the whole thing. Okay? The opposite. Whether you view the beginning thing as permitting the extra growth that comes after that. So that is that question. Do you think we could do 5 minutes of one more question? We've got it in us? Okay, I'm going to do 5 more minutes. The main reason I'm going to do this is I'll probably repeat it again tomorrow morning, but it's complicated. So it'll be an intro because tomorrow goes through this for quite some time. So we're not going to finish it, but we'll read like 4 more lines. One more case. Boy Rava. And Rashi changes the gears here to Rava. Ask Rava.
You bring the grafting.
Sorry, you cut off, Ken. Can you say it again?
No, it's the speaker today at Hebrew Institute discussed grafting in regard to etrog, and he said Rabbi Angel when he spoke today, and he said that apparently there's a disagreement between the Sephardim and the Ashkenazim. He brought Rav Uziel, who was the chief Sephardic rabbi for many years, and he permitted grafted etrogim, whereas many of the Ashkenazim do not. Ashkenazi.
Interesting. Can everyone hear me? Ken's cutting in and out. Is it your connection or mine?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, I just stopped my microphone because I wasn't sure. Ken, we only heard part of what you said, that he was talking about Rav Ben Zion Uziel talked about permitting grafted etrogim.
Ben Uziel talked regarding grafted etrogim, and he said he permitted them. Others, that many of the Ashkenazim do not.
Okay, interesting. Let's read one more case. This is a complicated case from Rava at the last line. Boy Rava, last line of Daf Ayin Tet Amabet. Samach Tet Amabet. Le'inyan ma'aser mai. Asked Rava, how do you view this le'inyan, the question of ma'aser? Remember that if you have, again, we'll take chita, which is the easy example. You have 100 stalks of grain. You're supposed to give 2 to the Kohen as truma and 10 to the Levi as ma'aser. How do you view grain that's replanted? Says, what's the case, right? What's the case that Rava was asking about? So Kigon, let's take a case at the top of Daf Ayin. You'll think about this case overnight. De'amdinu ve'asrinu. Here's what you did. You did something very clever. You basically cut down your grain branches, right? But instead of using your knife or your sickle or whatever they use, you uprooted them, right? So you basically have 100, let's just pick a number, 100 stalks of grain that all have wheat on them. And they're laying in a pile. You haven't yet, as Rashi puts it, you haven't yet stepped on them and separated the grain and done all of the rest of the work. But you've already harvested them, right? And what you do is you get up the asrin and you take maaser. So you take 10 of them and give them to the Levi. So the other 90 that are left behind, or 89, or 88, sorry, if you took truma, are permitted, right? And so if you were smart, maybe not, you would take them and you would separate out the grain and grind it up and make flour and have a delicious breakfast, right? But instead of doing that, you decided you're going to replant them. Vishatlinu, and you put them back in the ground, right? So now you have plants that have already had maaser taken from them that you put back in the ground, and you water them and they grow for another 2 weeks. The hosifalahu, and they add 20%, let's say, right? So the question now becomes, do you have to take maaser on the extra percent? Or do you say, I already took maaser on this plant, right? So this is a trick, right? You can take maaser on the plant, replant it, and not have to take maaser on the things that grow. Seems like a great hack, right? So this was Rava's question. That do you say that you go after the original growth? And if you go after the original growth you took maaser on. So you basically took a fully maasered plant, you put it in the ground, it grew 20% more, but you don't have to take maaser again. Or do you say you go after the new growth, right? So, and imtim salomar lo azlinam batar ikar, right? If you say, now this gets to a second and much more complex detail. Let's say you come out on the side that you don't go after the ikar, the tosefet boyasuri, and you have to take maaser on the amount that it added after you replanted it. Okay, so remember the case. You took 10 stalks, let's say, of grain. You've already taken maaser on them. You replanted them, and they each grew 20% higher. And now you harvest them. So if you say, says Rava, that you have to take maaser on that extra 20%, what about the original part? Do you have to take maaser on the whole thing a second time? Or do you not have to take maaser on the thing you already took maaser? Ikar mai. What about the main part, meaning the principle that you already took maaser, right? Why do you have to take maaser a second time on that? Because by replanting it, basically, you made it a new plant. And the same way you're chayiv in maaser on the growth, you're chayiv in maaser again on the ikar. That was the question that Rava asked. It's a really interesting question. And Abaya said to him, I don't understand. What's your question? My shna mikol chiti v'sari da'alma. Every single time you plant wheat or barley, you take a piece of grain that you already took maaser on, you put it in the ground, and you grow a new stalk of barley. And of course, you're taking maaser on the whole stalk. So why would this be any different? And Rava said back to him, "What do you mean? Of course it's different. Amar le davar shezaro kala lomi boile. If you put a seed in the ground, you never eat that seed again in your life, right? The seed becomes a plant. My question is, if you take a formed plant already, that already you took maaser on, and you put it in the ground and it grows 20%, do you now have to take maaser on the whole plant or only on the part that grew? And so we're going to stop here and we were going to figure this out tomorrow. Okay, so it's a cliffhanger. I'll read the case again tomorrow because it gets a little bit more complicated, just to be clear. But the question, of course, is, does the maaser that you took on the first part, which is very similar to our omer question, right? You uprooted the plant, the omer happened, and then you replanted it. Is it a new plant? Is it a growth of the old plant? And what is the halacha of maaser? And we'll continue that, God willing, tomorrow at 7:45 a.m. sharp. Hope to see you all there.
Thank you.
Farmers do this all the time. They do this all the
Shavua tov.
time. It's common. It's common practice.
So can I say that
Common
again?
practice. You take from your crops.
Right.
I said it's common practice. You harvest crops and you channel them even a good percentage of them back in the ground. Use them as fertilizer. You grow again. All the time. Farmers do this. It's very common. I
Right.
did that. I worked in the year. I mean,
So let me agree 100%. The point of the Gemara, and again, we'll get this tomorrow, is that when you usually do it, you take the seeds, you put them back in the ground and they grow. But our case is a little more complex because you're actually taking a plant that you harvested and you're putting the same plant back in the ground and then it grows additionally, right? So there the question is it like a seed or is it different because you're actually taking a formed plant and putting it in the ground and you already took Truman Maaser on the plant. So do you have to take it a second time when you harvest it the second time? And that's the question, and we're going to get into it more tomorrow.
people do that too. They take from they grow grain and they say, "Listen, I don't need all this. I put it back in the ground." They rechannel 20% of that or whatever,
Yeah,
30%. The farmers do that, even it's a fully formed plant.
great. So that's exactly the question.
It's common practice.
Okay,
And the
good.
other question would be if he didn't take miser on it and he puts it back in the ground, is he obligated to take miser on or whatever truma miser on the additional amount that he gained from what he had from before? See what I mean? Because he's multiplying his potential. Let's say he gets I don't know. let's say he grows whatever oranges, whatever the plant is, and he gets 50 oranges from his crop, and he says, "I'm going to put 25 of them back in the ground to help generate the produce." And then he gets out of that crop, he gets 70, he gets 100 oranges or whatever the wheat, grain, whatever the product is. I mean, I said oranges, maybe, but the point is, so now does he have to take Meiser on the original that he got, even though he never took it in the first place? And then he has to take, in addition to what he would take now that he gets 100 over the first 50. I don't know if the Gemara deals with it, but that's an additional question.
Right. It's a good question. Let me look into it. I don't know the answer either, but it's great. It's a great question. And tomorrow's daf, we'll talk about some of these details. I don't think we're going to cover that though, but it's a great question. Okay. Shavua Tov. Have a good night.
It's just ridiculous. Unbelievable. I can't even get this to shut down. I don't know. It's ridiculous.